Welcome to Now We're Getting Somewhere. I'm Katie, and I'm a certified life coach, but I've also been a management consultant at McKinsey and a product manager at a tech startup. In other words, I know what it feels like to have a life that looks pretty good on paper, but doesn't feel as good as I want it to. I help my professional clients develop lives that are more meaningful, happy, and also more successful. And I want to share the same practical insights with you. Let's go. Hey everyone. I'm recording this on a Thursday. Happy Thursday. Today I am finding you in the middle of my rest week. I call it a rest week in my mind. I see clients the first 3 weeks of the month, and then I take the last week of the month off of client calls. I've done that for a couple of reasons. One of them is I've just kind of done it all over the years, and I found that it's a really nice cadence for my clients to kind of see me a lot, to get to see me 3 weeks in a row, but then it's also really nice for them to kind of like have a break from me. I've found that to be better than either every week or just like twice a month. 3 times a month ends up being the sweet spot. I've also found that it's really nice for me to get 1 week a month off of client calls so I can just rest and do content like this, like podcasts and blog posts, and just be really fresh when I see my clients again. So I'm just feeling really grateful today that I built a business that lets me have some ebb and flow and work and rest. And I feel so blessed for that. So today on the pod, I want to talk about one big obstacle to clarity. So if you've been around these parts for a while, you know that clarity, really just another way of saying, figuring out what you want, that's a big theme that I work with a lot of clients on. Sometimes I work with them on very narrow clarity topics. So I have a client I'm working with right now who came to me with, a question like, I don't know what next step I want to take in my career. So a more narrow focus. It can also have a very kind of big picture, all-encompassing focus. So I have a different client right now who I'm working with who came to me and basically said just like, honestly, it doesn't seem like anything's working in my life right now. I don't like my job. I don't like where I live. I don't like my romantic life. A lot of my friendship and social life isn't really working. Kind of like everything's on the table clarity-wise. So whether it's narrow or big picture, like I said, I'm coaching on this all the time. And so I'm thinking all the time about what tools and skills and questions help in finding clarity. And I realized recently that there is one thing that gets in the way of clarity, honestly, with almost every client at one point or another. And it's something that I don't think I have named explicitly before. So I'll tell you that obstacle right now. And the obstacle is thinking too much about implementation before clarity is established. I'm going to say that again. Thinking too much about implementation before clarity is established can completely derail your clarity and as a result, actually also your implementation. So I want to do 2 things on this podcast. I've already told you the headline, but I want to make my case for why do we want to get clear on clarity before we even think too much about implementation. And then I want to share 4 ways that I see implementation thoughts getting in the way of achieving clarity. Some of them are obvious. Some of them are actually quite subtle. I think that even if you're on board with my overall argument, you may or may not realize kind of some of these ways in which your own implementation thoughts might be getting in your way. And I'm also going to give some real client examples because I think our brains always learn so well from those. So if you want clarity and you don't yet have it, or you just want to build your skillfulness here, so, when you need clarity in the future, you'll have those skills ready, this episode is for you. Let's go. So as I said, I first just want to make my case. Why do we really want to establish clarity before even thinking too much about implementation? So before we do that, I just want to make sure we've kind of clearly defined the terms. So I already mentioned clarity to me is just knowing what you want. I sometimes will talk about compass work or compass skills in relation to clarity. Those are really just like the skills that are needed to have clarity. So this is all kind of this clarity bucket, big piece of work that I do. And then second, implementation, that's just the process of actually getting what you want. That's turning on that engine and getting the thing done, implementing whatever you have clarity on. You might be moving to Berlin, or you might be quitting a job, or you might be starting a business, just to give 3 examples that are happening for clients of mine right now. And obviously I do a lot of implementation work with clients as well. So what I have found in working with clients is that there is a tendency in many of our brains, when we have even a hint, even a whisper of clarity, to immediately jump to implementation, like a fraction of a second later. And then doubt and fear decently often completely take over. And as a result, my clients lose even their clarity. They become so worried about, can I actually start that business or meet that partner? Am I cut out for that? Am I too tired to even do that? Is that logistically feasible? Would my husband or my kids get mad? All these thoughts about implementation that they begin to doubt that they even want these things in the first place. And then they're back on, in that swirl of confusion and not knowing and lostness. And of course, from there, you're also not implementing, right? So you don't have clarity or implementation at that point. Versus on the flip side, if I can just get them to figure out what they want and just sit in that knowing for a bit, for a day, a week, a month, then one of two things will typically start to happen. The first one is that once they actually have clarity, typically implementation can be figured out step by step in some way that does work for you. Sometimes we decide that something is completely impossible, and actually it is more possible than we think. There's almost always way more possibility than my clients, or even honestly me, see for ourselves at first. So that's the first thing that often happens once we find clarity. But the second thing that happens is that sometimes the biggest version of what we imagine is impossible, at least for now. But it is still super helpful to know what we want, to know clearly with clarity what we dream of. Because there's usually elements of what we are wanting, practical elements in the world that we can implement, or elements of how we want to feel that we can move towards now. But so often I see clients who, again, have that flash of insight, then they immediately, a fraction of a second later, before they've even realized it's happened, they've jumped to thinking about implementation, and then they get lost and swirly. And again, they can stay there in that swirliness for months or years. And because they're so lost and confused, they wouldn't even say that they know what they want. They just, they would say they don't know what they want. And of course, they're definitely not moving towards it. And that's just a terrible way to feel. It's a terrible way to live. So that's my argument for why we want to kind of pull apart these pieces. To the extent that we can, we want to think about clarity before implementation. I literally say that to clients a lot, like clarity before implementation. We got to do it in that order. And it may be that, again, just naming that phenomenon, just sort of really explaining how this works is all that you need in order to see it in action for yourself in the future. Now that you know it, you can notice as you're trying to get clear on what you want, oh, you're right. I am jumping to implementation just a quarter of a second after I got clarity. If that's true for you, amazing. But I also wanted to spend the rest of this podcast fleshing out some of the other ways in which this phenomenon happens. I want to create the full list of how this can manifest itself, because it can manifest itself in really obvious ways, or it can manifest itself in very subtle ways. And I want you to hear some real client examples of this in action. So again, once we've spotted it in others, it's easier to spot in ourselves. So with that all in mind, here are 4 tells or 4 signs that implementation has gotten in the way of clarity. Okay, so the first tell is actually the most obvious one, but it's still worth being said. The most common thing that happens is that my clients will, literally start talking about implementation. They will tell me things about implementation. So to give a real client example, I have one client who came to me wanting, among other things, to have clarity in her career next steps. She'd been without clarity for a very long time. And she truly came to me saying things like, Katie, it's such a mess. I really didn't like what I was doing before, but I have no idea what I might want to do next. It's so confusing. Maybe I can't know. Maybe it's unknowable. She was very turned around. And then one day, a few months into our work together, in the middle of us talking about some other things, she kind of blurted out what she wanted to do with her career. It turned out she wanted to do something in music, which she has a background in, she's quite skillful at, and she hadn't ever really done professionally. And then basically immediately after, really almost half a second after that happened, she was immediately telling me about the logistics of it, that it was going to be very complex. How was she possibly going to do it? She was giving me sort of details about how it might happen. And I was like, whoa, girl, you just had clarity. Like, this is a huge deal. This is pop the champagne level of a big deal. This is the thing I have to do a lot because my clients just want to move on, even though they've just done something really important, because her brain was so focused on implementation that she couldn't even see that she'd gotten this huge thing that she had wanted, clarity. Because again, let me just underline, she had come to me even despairing that it was possible to know what she wanted as a career step. She was like, Katie, I'm never going to know what I want. I'm so lost and turned around. And now she had it. But she'd been so focused on the fact that she didn't yet know every detail of implementation. And she was kind of missing that she'd actually achieved this huge milestone. Her worries about implementation would have, if we had perhaps not been together, kind of buried and caused her to dismiss this whole thing and miss clarity entirely. But once I could kind of stabilize her in clarity for a breath and then a whole conversation and kind of remind her that she didn't have to implement yet, wouldn't you know it, in the coming weeks, she started to get little bits and bobs of ideas for how she might actually start and implement. It turns out she did have ideas. She did have leads. This whole new direction was maybe actually kind of doable now that she had stabilized her brain. Once her brain could more confidently and calmly say, you know what, this is what I want. I am clear about that. Then the problem-solving part could kick in, and it did kick in, as I said. So that's the first kind of more obvious way that implementation thoughts can get in the way. You start to have literal logistical thoughts about how you're going to accomplish your thing. But like I said, I wanted to flesh it out and give this client example because even though it's the most obvious version of it, it happens to almost all of us. It happens to me. It probably happens to you. So I just wanted you to hear this client example so you can remember it better and hopefully find it in yourself more easily. So that's the first way that thoughts about implementation can derail clarity. The second way in which concerns about implementation can get in the way is more subtle. This one is more about temperament and personality. So I'll give another different client example. I have another client right now, a different client, who also came to me wanting clarity about next steps in her career. We explored a bunch of different options together, and she finally realized that she wanted to have a start. She wanted to start her own company. And it's almost as soon as she said that, she started to have some concerns about her personality and her temperament. So she would give me examples of these startup founders that she was aware of who had stood outside buildings to basically mob people that they wanted to talk to when those people left the office for the day. And she felt that she didn't have the temperament of somebody to do that. So was that going to mean that her startup would never succeed? Or she was telling me things like, maybe I'm not resilient in the way that she perceived other people to be. Is that going to mean that our startup wouldn't succeed? She and I talked about all these fears and the ways in which they probably wouldn't actually stand in her way. Of course we did that, but really underneath it all, what was happening was she was jumping into implementation. She was worrying about whether she could get it done rather than asking, do I want to get it done? I'm going to say that again because it lands in my body and it's important. She was worrying about whether she could get it done rather than asking, do I want to get this done? There is a funny way in which worrying about whether she could get it done, whether she had the personality, the temperament, it was almost a red herring. Because the most important thing to establish first was just whether she wanted to do this. So many things can be figured out if you really want to do this. And again, I'm going to say this over and over, and I say this to my clients all the time, implementation matters. Startups are not built on dreams and fairy dust and rainbows. I work with clients in implementation every day of the week too, but so many of my clients come to me having also craved clarity for months or years. So I'm just here to say, again, let's just check that box first. Let's just know what you actually want first, as clearly as we can, and then we're going to get to implementation. Because if you worry too much about implementation up front, decently often we'll never get to clarity. So that's the second way in which this kind of thoughts about implementation can sneak in before clarity is established, in these worries about temperament or personality. The third tell or sign that thoughts about implementation are jumping in a little too early is that the client will just get really freaked out in a very broad way. And I want to say, of course, that people tell me things that are big. Like, I have people tell me about businesses they want to start in totally unrelated fields that are going to require significant startup capital. I have people tell me about changes in their sexuality that they have not yet told their spouses about. I have people tell me really important and meaty things about how they feel in a relationship or about parenthood. And I totally get why things like that would freak you out. That is understandable. If you choose to implement those things, they may impact your personal finances or relationships in some way, and possibly even a really big way. But when I encounter fears like that, the first thing I want to do still, you're getting the theme here, is just to establish clarity, because we want to be really sure that they want this. Sometimes we blurt out big feelings and we don't actually want it. And of course, on the flip side, sometimes we do. But I find that my clients need a safe space where we can really give those ideas room to breathe, to figure out if they have legs. And to do that, to figure out if that idea is true, to figure out if it has legs, we need to figure out a way for the client to feel safe. Even just engaging with this idea, with this dreaming, with this question of possibility. So there's various things I might say to a client that you might say to yourself if we weren't working together. If there's something relational that they're concerned about, I'll say something like, okay, so let's just imagine for now that nobody will be hurt. No matter what you choose, no one's going to be hurt. No one will mind. Do you still want this? What would you choose? Or if they're worried about the money side of things, I'm going to say something similar, but on the money side. I would say something like, okay, let's say for now that no matter what you choose, you're going to make the same amount of money. Or I would say, okay, let's say for now that you're going to be okay financially either way. This depends a little bit on the situation. The reason why I do this, again, is because it's really important for you and me as your coach to at least know what you want. And if I'm not there with you, if you're not my client, I still think it's really important for you to at least be honest with yourself in the intimacy of yourself, of your soul, about what you really want. I'm going to say that again because it lands in me. I think it's really important for you to at least be honest with yourself in the intimacy of your soul about what you really want. I know that it can feel scary to get clarity because you know that if, sometimes when you touch something, that it's real and true and important. And so you're immediately thinking about like, oh shoot, what if I have to go implement this? But I want to remind you, the moment when you actually leave safety is implementation. Dreaming does not actually endanger you. I'm going to say that again. The moment when you actually leave safety is implementation. Dreaming does not actually endanger you. And if you feel unsafe, it's because you've jumped to implementation. So just stay here for a sec. Stay in clarity. Get clarity here. And yes, I'm going to say it again and again. We're going to get to implementation. You're going to get to implementation. But if you needed clarity, if you wanted clarity, then freaking just hang out in clarity for a week or two before jumping to implementation. So that's the third tell, just this very generalized freak out. And then the fourth tell is that a client will often start to freak out because they can't or don't want to implement right now. The most common reason that they do this relates to energy. So I'll give another client example here. One of my clients came to me wanting clarity about next steps in her career. It's funny, I guess, like all my examples for this episode are related to career, but I do that a decent amount. So we were working on that. But it came up kind of front and center for her as we started to talk about that she was also very burnt out and exhausted, and she had been for many years. So she finally let herself rest. She really gave herself permission to do that, which took a lot of work and courage on her part. And after a few months of that, kind of clarity about her professional steps kind of bubbled up and became clear in one of our sessions. And once that happened, a part of her freaked out a bit, because going in this new career direction would be uncertain and would require establishing herself in a somewhat new professional field. And part of her just started to kind of shut down because it sounded like too much and she really didn't feel up to doing that right now. And we had a good coaching conversation then about how that's actually totally fine. It is okay to know what she wants to pursue in her next season, but not be in that season right now. This season that she's in right now is about rest. That's the next season. It's okay to know what's coming up next without being there right now. Again, clarity or knowing what you want and implementation, which is actually getting what you want, those are two different things. You do not have to implement until you're ready. And that might be a while from now. There are things that I want to implement in my own life personally that I don't have the capacity for right now, but it doesn't do me any favors to deny that I want those things. Oh, I like that. Anyway, it's okay to live in a liminal space with clarity, but not yet moving to implementation. Okay, my friends, that's my list. Those are the 4 ways that implementation can get in the way of clarity. I'm just going to list those again for all of our brains. The first one is that you will explicitly start thinking about implementation. How would I get this done? The second is that you may start worrying about your temperament or personality and whether that temperament or personality can implement, well. Third, you'll have just a very generalized freak out, often that you're going to mess something up, like your personal finances or relationship. And the fourth is that you'll start saying, I can't implement right now. I don't want to implement right now. And that will often be because you're tired. And I'll say what I've said before again, of course, we have to eventually think about implementation. Of course, clarity alone is never enough. But also, clarity alone is important. And many of my clients come to me wanting clarity for months or years because they've never had it. And they're pulling out their hair and they're feeling so lost and annoyed. And I find that if we have them slow down, if we have them focus on clarity first, then we can ultimately also move to implementation, which is what everybody wants. So I hope this helps you when you're on your own search for clarity, when you're journaling or taking long solo walks or just sitting in a chair outside and letting your mind wander. I hope you will notice if or when your brain jumps to implementation, and it will help you have more skillfulness in pulling your brain back to something that would be more useful. I'm rooting for you, everybody. Take care. If you really want to change in a meaningful, lasting way, that's when you need a life coach. Every client I've worked with has had incredibly personalized reasons why they're in the tired or anxious or stuck or uninspired state they're in. Working with me can help you identify those roadblocks, which are usually blind spots that you genuinely cannot see, and implement a profoundly customized, doable plan for overcoming them. I have a very small, high-end, one-on-one coaching practice. If you'd like to be my next client, reach out at katiesiever.com. I'd love to meet you.